agenda. It is my pleasure to introduce two remarkable Rotarians of the Rotary Club of Whitby. They received the Paul Harris Fellowship in 2009 due to their efforts with Rotary at work. More recently, they received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joe Dale and Mr. Mark Wafer, could you please stand up? Joe Dale is the owner and CEO of Vision Consulting and Executive Director of the Ontario Disability Employment Network. Joe has worked in the field of disability employment for over 35 years. He is a member of Ontario's Lieutenant Governor's Accessibility Team, founder of the Rotary at Work initiative, and a consultant with all levels of government in regards to policy creation and focus on disability matters. Joe is a wine enthusiast and decorated winemaker and wine judge. Joe lives in Whitby, Ontario. Mark Wafer is the owner of 7 Tim Hortons locations in Toronto. In the past 18 years, Mark and his wife Valerie hired 93 people with disabilities and currently employ 41 individuals with disabilities in all aspects of the business from entry level to management. Mark believes that there is a compelling business case for inclusive hiring practices. Mark is a member of the Federal Panel of Labor Market Opportunities and a member of the Lieutenant Governor's Accessibility Team and a founding member of Canada's new National Strategy on Disability Employment. In his spare time, Mark is a motorsport enthusiast and a former amateur sports car champion. He lives in Ashburn, Ontario. I would like to ask Joe Dale to come and take the floor.
Are we okay with this volume? You can hear us all right? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And as you heard in the introduction, I'm a winemaker, and my wife loves the hobby. I make it, she drinks it. So it's a good partnership, speaking of partnerships. So obviously you can tell from the evening that we're going to talk about employment for people with disabilities. And what I find often when I go into communities is that the communities don't typically have a good understanding of what disability looks like in their own neighborhoods and in their own backyard. And this is especially the case in business, but across the board. So I'm going to start with a few facts and figures. Today in Canada, 16% of our population is comprised of people who live with a disability. Now with disability, we're talking about blind, deaf, physical disability, intellectual disability, mental health disabilities, the whole gamut. But at 16%, that's the equivalent of the combined populations of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. That's how many people live with a disability in Canada today. And in fact, it's the largest minority in the country. Now, according to recent studies, that's going to grow to 20% by the end of this decade. So 1 in 5 people will have a disability in Canada. Now in Ontario, to bring it a little more local, that equates to 1.9 million Ontarians. Right now 1 in 7, and as I said, growing. Disability exists in every community and every neighborhood. It knows no barriers or boundaries of race, religion, socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter, disability crosses all those lines. The unfortunate reality for adults who have a disability is that 49% are unemployed. Now that number comes from Statistics Canada, 49% unemployed. But we know that if we include all of those people who are not attached to the labor market, people who have never been able to get a job, people who have given up trying, people who have dropped out, that number soars closer to 70 to 75% unemployment for people with disabilities here in Ontario today. A recent study in the U.S. showed that only 18% of adults with disabilities in the U.S. have a job. Now, we do marginally better than that, but only marginally, so we know this 70% is a conservative figure. Disability has a very large economic consequence. So this year in Ontario, taxpayers will spend $4 billion on pension payments for people with disabilities who are not in the workforce. $4 billion. That's a big number, but what's more astounding is that in the last 5 years, that's been growing at about 5.5% per year. So it's not a controllable expenditure of taxpayer dollars. And so today we see the Minister of Finance getting on to the back of the Minister of Community and Social Services saying, how can we control this expenditure? It's a big expenditure. But on the flip side of it, if you have a disability, and if you're lucky enough to get the maximum benefit, you're living on $11,000 a year. So by virtue of having that disability, you're most likely out of the workforce and living in poverty here in Ontario and the rest of Canada today. Now, one of the interesting things we see and we hear about all the time currently is labor shortages. Labor shortages, some people say labor mismatch, whatever the issue is, we have a problem with businesses getting skilled and unskilled workers into their businesses. So somehow we've got this large pool of talent, largely untapped, yet we have businesses looking for labor and looking for workers. So I think what we want to do is try to bridge that gap and bring those two parties together. We know these labor shortages to be reasonably true. In fact, the Conference Board of Canada has predicted a 1 million worker shortfall by 2020. Now, that's in spite of immigration, and what that's going to cause is a 1.3 drop in GDP. So that's going to affect the standard of living for all of us. Last year, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses did a survey of their members, and 34% of their members cited a shortage of skilled labor as their #1 business constraint already. And more tellingly, 13% cited a shortage of unskilled labor as their #1 business constraint. So now we hear businesses all talking about foreign worker programs. And you know, even the foreign worker programs are even going in and looking for unskilled labor at a high cost. Yet we have people living in every community who want to work and can't break through that barrier. Now this is Noel. Noel was a trained electrical engineer, and for many, many years Noel applied his trade at General Motors in Oshawa. But as Noel aged, he had contracted macular degeneration, a visual impairment of blindness. And when Noel got macular degeneration, he lost his job. Now when Mark and I first started doing these types of presentations 5 years ago last month, one of the first presentations, one gentleman stuck his hand up and said, okay, Joe, I'll try it. I'll hire someone with a disability in my business. Noel had been on the job about a year when I met him. I got to go in and talk to him about the job and how things were going, and I asked him, so how is it going, Noel? And I'll never forget the words he used, because he said to me, Joe, this job has given me back my life. I never thought I'd work again. I've been unemployed for 7 years, living off the taxpayer. Now I've got a job, I'm paying taxes, my wife and I have our own home back, I'm contributing, it's given me back my life. Now that's a very compelling story to hear someone say that to you. But the other reality is that any one of us in this room could join the ranks of Noel and other people with disabilities. Next week, next month, next year, by virtue of accident or illness or injury, any one of us could be faced with these barriers and find themselves unemployed and fighting to get back in the workforce. So our goal is quite simple, and that's to introduce businesses to a good, reliable, dependable source of labor.
So on the screen, you're going to see a series of questions come up. These are the myths and misperceptions that a person with a disability faces in order to get into the workplace. So if you look at the places where you work, where you own, the HR department, what are they looking at when a person comes in for an interview and is in a wheelchair? They're looking at that wheelchair, or are they looking at the ability that that person may bring to the job? The myths and misperceptions are the greatest barrier that a person with a disability faces in order to get into the workforce. Attitude is the #1 barrier. So the question's going to come up. If you know the answer, I want you to shout it out. I brought a $2 tip card all the way from Toronto.
Wait a minute. We stopped on the way here and you had like 29 cents left or something.
I tried. A DuPont study showed what percentage of workers who have a disability scored average or above average in performance ratings. 90%. 90%. A Harris study showed What percentage of employers say that workers who have a disability work harder than other employees? 46.
Trick question. He's really tough with those questions.
I've never had to give up that $2 tip. But that is a very high number. 46% is a very high number. Most job accommodations cost less than how much money?
500.
500 bucks.
And in fact, fewer than 4% of people with disabilities require any accommodations at all. So it's a very relatively small number of people, and on average, a small cost.
Quite often, Joe and I will speak with corporations, CEOs, and they say to us, well, we can't really afford the accommodation. But the reality is, 500 bucks or less, if they can. According to a DuPont survey, what percentage of employees who have a disability have average to above average attendance records? 86%. Job is very questioned. It can sometimes take years for a person with a disability to get a job, their first job. Not necessarily the job they went to school for or were trained for, any job. In 2011, I have 41 employees who have a disability in every department. In 2011, we did not have a single hour of lost sick time for those 41 individuals. Yes, they took time off. Yes, they had doctor's appointments, but not a single hour of lost sick time. Pretty profound. There's not a lot of companies that can brag about that. Yeah, we blew that record in 2012 because one of my bakers who's profoundly deaf, she got married. She went on a honeymoon. And she lay on a beach for 3 days and she got sunstroke. So she came back and she had to take 3 sick days. So we banned honeymoons. What percentage, this is my pet peeve, this is the big one. What percentage of workers who have a disability rated average to above average in terms of safety on the job? Well, what we know for sure is that by being an inclusive employer, by including people with disabilities, your safety rating is at least the same. At least the same. But there's a lot of studies that have been done. And some studies that are coming out of the United States right now are showing a very big increase in safety for those companies that have built capacity for people with disabilities. In fact, 97% greater safety rating.
Mark, in 18 years, you've had 93 employees with disabilities. How many insurance claims have you processed for those employees?
None. Not one. I know what the rest of them cost me. People who have a disability, their family and close relations comprise what percentage of the marketplace? 1 and 2. It's 53%. Huge marketplace opportunity for any corporation.
So just to put that in practical sense, I'll give you an example. Last year I was at a conference, and at the end of the day, a group of us decided to go out for dinner. There was 18 of us, one gentleman who was in a wheelchair. We passed by 4 restaurants in Toronto that could not accommodate his wheelchair before we found a restaurant to go in. So those restaurants didn't just lose his business, they lost the business of 18 people that night. And when you think about families who have disabled members in their family, when they go out as a family unit. They don't want to go out and leave the disabled person at home. They want to go together. So when you think about it as a marketplace issue, how do we attract people with disabilities into our businesses? How do we develop the products and services that they need to buy and want to buy? How do we get their dollar and really service them in the best way possible? And that's going to happen through more awareness around accessibility and those types of issues.
When we discuss this number with CEOs and with executives, we don't give them those answers. We ask them that question, but we don't give them the answer. We always get a single-digit answer, sometimes 1, 2, or 3%. If they don't realize just how massive this marketplace really is. Workers who have a disability are how many times more likely to stay on the job than other workers? Up to 5 times. That's a huge, tangible benefit for any business.
So in your business, Mark, what is the average tenure of a non-disabled employee?
1 year and 4 months.
And are employees who have disabilities?
7 years.
7 years.
7 years.
Wow. What's the average turnover rate for a fast food restaurant in the GTA?
Well, the quick service restaurant industry in the GTA has an average turnover rate of somewhere between 75 and 95%.
Per year?
Per year.
Wow. And in your business?
40%. That's not because I'm a better operator. I like to think I am. Because I'm an inclusive employer. So, 41 people who I have working with me, who have a disability today, they don't leave. Because for you, for me, we'll go across the street for $1 more. And we'll take that chance. For them, who ask not so much we know on the other side of the thing, they have it for sure thing. But the interesting thing is, I have 210 employees who do not have a disability. They turn over at a lower rate as well. Because they want to be part of something special, something inclusive. It means something to them to work for an inclusive employer. Now let's put that into dollars and cents. When you went to Tim Hortons this morning to get your first coffee of the day, you did go to Tim Hortons this morning.
No shame.
I remember now, yeah, that's where I went to Tim Hortons. That person who serves your coffee, for me to replace that one person, can cost me as much as $4,000. Because I have to advertise, procurement, interviews. You got to interview 25 people to get one good hire. Uniforms, training. Training now is very extensive before a person even learns how to go properly. Lot of productivity of a person who is new versus an employee who's been with you for a long time. So it's about $4,000. That you do the math. If my colleague down the street has a typical turnover rate of 75%, he's doing just as good a job as I am, and I have a turnover rate of 40%, I'm making more money. I'm making more money by being an inclusive employer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the business case for inclusive employment right there. That is how we're going to make change. You can't make change with this by talking about emotion. We can't make change by talking about compliance and laws and legislation. We can make change with the business case. And the last question, less than what percentage of people who have a disability use a wheelchair or a scooter? And the answer is 6%. That's an important question. You know, if you talk to somebody who doesn't know anything about disabilities and just use that word, you have a picture in their mind right away of a wheelchair. But the reality is only 6% of people who have a disability use a wheelchair. If you talk to a 4-year-old today and ask them to name some symbols, the first one they always mention is the golden urchins. We won't talk about those guys anymore. But the second one will be the wheelchair person sign. They all know that one. So it kind of perpetuates that myth as they grow up, that everybody who has a disability is in a wheelchair, and that's not true. So this is Clint. And Clint is the reason I began hiring people with disabilities way back when my wife and I opened our first store in Scarborough. It was a big store. That's 65 seats, large dining room, and very quickly I realized I wasn't going to be able to keep up. My staff couldn't keep up. We needed to hire. We had a need. So I put an ad on the door. Dining room attendant needed. Clint walks in. Clint has Down syndrome. Up to that point in my life, I hadn't been around people with intellectual disabilities. I didn't really know what to expect. But I decided to go ahead and give Clint the job anyway. Now, as you can imagine, the training was going to take a little bit longer. I didn't have that time. My managers didn't have that time. We're working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to get our business off the ground. So we enlisted the help of Community Living Toronto, a large community organization with excellent job coaches. Those job coaches came out and helped me to train Clint. That's a service that's free of charge to every Canadian company, large or small. We had to teach Clint how to take a bus. He knew what the buses looked like, but he couldn't tell the difference in the numbers. And that took time too, time that we didn't have. After 2 weeks, Clint came on board, and I noticed very quickly that Clint was my best employee. Came to work early, went home late, wanted to work through his breaks. When he wasn't working and he was at home, and family members came over, that's all he talked about was his job. His job meant so much to him. So as my business grew and I added stores, I continued to hire people with intellectual disabilities. And I started to notice my absenteeism rate going down. My turnover rate was starting to go down. So we started to hire people with all types of disabilities. Deaf, blind, physical, mental health, everything. In all areas of the business, including management. Clint's still with me today, almost 19 years later. 40 years old. In 2006, he married his high school sweetheart, and then the next year he bought a condo, and he's living in that condo with his wife, living a full life, the life that you want for yourself, and that we want for our children, simply because Clint has a meaningful and competitively paid job.
Some of the other things that people ask us about is productivity for people with disabilities. Now, Walgreens, many of you may know, is a large pharmacy retailer in the U.S. And in 2006, they embarked on a new, what they thought at the time was an experiment. They opened a distribution center in South Carolina where they intended to hire 30% of the workforce to be made up of people with disabilities. In the end, 40% of the workers were people with disabilities. And at the end of the first year, they were ranked the highest productivity output distribution center in the entire U.S. A year later, they opened another center in Connecticut. By this time, they were trying to track all the information and the data so that they could validate what was going on. But in Connecticut, 47% of the workforce was comprised of people with disabilities. I happened to have the opportunity this time last year to go and visit this plant in Connecticut. And it was quite amazing. We had people with autism, with Down syndrome, with intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, the whole gamut, but 47% of the workforce. That distribution center has now had the highest productivity rating of any distribution center in the U.S. every year since opening, and 40% lower safety incident ratings, 67% lower medical treatment costs, 63% lower absenteeism, and the non-payroll employee costs are 78% lower than the chain's industry average. That from including people with disabilities in the workforce. Randy Lewis, the VP of Operations, was fascinating to hear him speak because he talked about the people they hired and how it worked out. And what he said was, these are great numbers, and he reports to shareholders every quarter, and the shareholders love to see these numbers, but he said what it had done was change the culture of the organization. And they had found it trained all their managers to become better people managers. That once they learned how to work with people with disabilities and manage them and support them, that they were better managers across the board with all their employees. A great story. We hear all sorts of stories about better productivity, improved employee morale, improved management skills, greater loyalty and dedication. Over and over again we hear these stories. Great corporate profile. And the customers really like it. Customers like to do business in businesses that reflect the community they live in and the people that may be in their families. Now this is Kelly. This is an interesting story for a different reason. Kelly also has Down syndrome, but she works in a law firm in London, Ontario, Cohen Hiley. It's a fair-sized firm, 30 lawyers and 80 support staff, so it's a good-sized firm. And when the firm first came to us, they said, you know, we'd like to try this, but we're not sure what someone like Kelly can do in our business. So again, Community Living went into the business, spent 2 or 3 hours analyzing all the jobs, all the tasks, and all the work. And at the end of the day, came back and said, you know, there probably is no one single job that Kelly could do here. However, if we took bits and pieces of other people's work, we could create a job for Kelly. Now, we're not typically in the business of creating jobs where jobs don't exist, but the firm was adamant they wanted to try. So we took the filing, the photocopying, delivering mail, getting faxes back and forth between the lawyer's office, setting up for meetings, a whole host of tasks, and created a full-time job for Kelly. Now, 4 years later, I asked Joe Wafer, who's the managing partner, who was actually going to be here this evening but got caught in the snow in London, Joe Wafer to come and speak to a business group like this. And he said, okay. And he started his presentation by saying, you know, we always knew this was the right thing to do. But since we were asked to speak today, we thought we'd better make sure we really know what we're talking about. So we did a complete appraisal of the work that Kelly does for us. And we believe that she saves us the cost of 2.5 legal secretaries. Because those highly trained, highly skilled, highly paid people no longer have to leave their workstations to file, to photocopy, deliver mail. All tasks and work that needs to be done, but not necessarily in the traditional way. Not only that, but in 4 years, Kelly hasn't missed a single day of work, and they had to force her to take her vacation because she loves coming to work so much. Now, one of the things that we find, and one of the challenges we find for people with disabilities, is that they are so used to being turned down and rejected and turned away and told no, that, you know, their self-confidence hurts from that. And when we look at the typical way that we hire, that prescribed job description that we post, a person with a disability will look at that, and if there's 1 or 2 items on it they can't do, they won't even apply. That job posting becomes a barrier. But as we look forward, we have to think about, can we get outside the box a little bit and say, well, what is the work we need to get done in our place of business? And can we construct it differently and create opportunities for people like Kelly? Kelly has now worked at the firm 20 years. Joe Wafer says customers come to them all the time saying, the reason we do business with you is because you do this. Kelly is the ambassador for all of their public affairs and public events that they do, all their fundraising events for the community. She too is married, owns her own condo, and living a very full and happy life. That's in a very high professional industry. So there are some strategies for business. The first one, hopefully it's obvious by now, is to not automatically dismiss people who come looking for work just because they have a disability. Try to see past that disability and figure out what are the abilities and skills that that person can bring to the job and offer your business. You know, there's a lot of opportunities. Some people who have been out of the workforce for a long time are quite happy with part-time jobs to get started and build their capacity. And that's a great way to try it. There's a huge need to get kids with disabilities into the workforce with summer jobs and after-school jobs. Kids with disabilities are also shut out of the workplace. So we had, 2 years ago, Mark and I had a young man come to us. He was a lawyer. He was called to the bar in 2004. He had never worked. He had asked Mark for a job pouring coffee at Tim Hortons. And no disrespect, but what a waste of talent. We've been approached by lawyers, by MBAs, and in fact, this year in Ontario, 56,000 kids with disabilities entered post-secondary education. We have the highest growth rate in the world with post-secondary education for people with disabilities. It's growing at 15% a year. In the US, its growth is 1.5% by comparison. But if 4 years from now those kids graduate and have no jobs and face 70% unemployment, we've done a great disservice and we've missed out on a lot of talent. So, kids with disabilities, they need summer jobs. What an easy way for you to have a risk-free way of trying it out. How does it work in my business? How do I get accustomed to people with disabilities? How do my customers get used to it? It's a great low-risk way of trying things out and giving those kids resumes and experiences that they need.
In Canada today, there are 800,000 job-ready people unemployed, whoever is employed. 800,000 who are job-ready. There's many more who are unemployed, who are not quite job-ready yet. But 800,000 ready to take a job tomorrow. Of those, 340,000 have a post-secondary education. It's the highest in the world. We don't have any problems at all. getting our students through post-secondary education when they have a disability. But we sure as that we have a work on getting them into the workforce afterwards.
So the other strategy, and Mark referenced it earlier, is to look at your community partners here. We have, Stride, we have Bennett Edge, we have Community Living. All of these organizations have pools of candidates looking for jobs, and they can offer you all of those supports, the job training, the job coaching, any accommodation expertise that you may need. It maybe doesn't happen very often, but they have that expertise, and you should look at those community partners as professional consultants that can help you integrate people with disabilities into the workplace. And those are the real key strategies to moving things forward. But ultimately, we believe that being an inclusive employer is going to give you a competitive advantage. It's going to help you reach new marketplaces, develop new products and services, really bring in more customers, and to meet your labor needs. We believe that by including people with disabilities, you're going to see an increase in business performance. It's going to affect your bottom line, but in a healthy and positive way. Sir?
I have a question. So people that are disabled, however you want to refer to it, and they are getting government benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So you hire them and they can only work, say, maybe 20 hours a day or a week or 15 hours a week or so on. If they work longer than that, they lose their benefits. How do we get around that?
Well, I don't think we need to get around it. First of all, we need to understand it. The way it works now is people who are getting a disability benefit
Yes.
and who start to earn money from employment, they lose their benefit on a declining scale. But at the end of the month, the combination of their reduced benefit and their wages is always more money in their pocket. Right? And people don't necessarily understand that that's how it plays in. Yes, people should decline their dependency on the state and should become taxpayers, like the rest of us. But there is that assistance of how we get there, from starting with no employment to going to full employment. So their benefits decline gradually. A person on a disability pension has to be making somewhere in excess of $21,000 a year before they get no financial benefits, but they can still keep their medical benefits so long as the employer doesn't have a plan.
Oh, that's
Forever. But if the employer has a plan, they're obliged to kick in like any other employee.
Okay. So if you don't have a plan, then they can still keep their medical
Forever.
benefits and work longer hours.
Forever.
Okay. Thank you.
A person is always better off working.
Well, I realize that.
It's always better off working.
And that's just the financial side.
Yes.
So we're going to bring up, we have a panel of local employers now that are going to talk about their experiences on the job. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor, if that's okay with you folks after the panel. We want to make sure they've got time before that great meal starts to settle in and people start to